Let's read in 1 Peter chapter 5 and the first 4 verses of the chapter. The elders which are among you I exhort, who am also an elder, and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being ensamples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd shall appear, ye shall receive a crown of glory that fadeth not away. Chapter 4 ends with the reassurance that there is a faithful Creator who is able to keep our souls. So it is then striking that chapter 5 begins with an exhortation to faithfulness on the part of those who have a responsibility to care for God's flock. Feed the flock of God is what Peter urges in verse 2. The idea of feeding the flock conveys all that tender care that a shepherd exhibits towards his sheep. You might remember in Ezekiel chapter 34 verse 2 that the prophet reprimanded the shepherds of Israel with these words: Woe be to the shepherds of Israel that do feed themselves, should not the shepherds feed the flocks? In contrast, Isaiah provides a beautiful picture of the Lord Jesus. He shall feed his flock like a shepherd. He shall gather the lambs with his arm and carry them in his bosom, and shall gently lead those that are with young. That's Isaiah chapter 40 verse 11. And that's how we should care for God's people. Now, it's often been pointed out that there should be a closeness between the elders and the flock. In verse 1, Peter addresses the flock and refers to the elders which are among you. And then in verse 2, he addresses the elders and he speaks of the flock of God which is among you. Now, the picture of the shepherds and the sheep moving together is a very vivid picture. That is proper care. Indeed, in the same verse, it is described as taking the oversight thereof willingly. In other words, with a willing heart, for their profit and not for our own, that is, not for filthy lucre. Indeed, it might be important to say that all of our service for God should be done with this genuine spirit. The lining of our pockets or the accumulation of possessions from God's people should be anathema to us. It has a very poor pedigree in the form of Judas Iscariot, who was a thief and had the bag and bore what was put therein, as John 12 verse 6 says. The reward that God has for those who are faithful is not made up of things that are perishing, but it is a crown of glory that fadeth not away, verse number 4. That will be given by the chief shepherd, the one who's also called the good shepherd in John chapter 10 and the great shepherd in Hebrews chapter 13. Now, it is important that we all understand that being an elder does not give anyone a position of power over God's people. To be an elder is to be a servant. That was the lesson that King Rehoboam failed to learn in 1 Kings chapter 12, when the old men counselled him in verse 7 to be a servant unto this people. Through his churlish attempt to dictate to his care, he lost the most of his flock. That's why Peter writes, neither as being lords over God's heritage, in verse number 3. The Lord Jesus said, I am among you as he that serveth, Luke 22 verse 27. So to be a servant of God's people is a very honourable station, and we should aspire to serve as he did.